May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, be acceptable to you. O Lord, my rock and my redeemer, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Iule ratson imre fivegion libi lefanecha Adonai tzuri v'goali Adonai tzuri v'goali Adonai tzuri v'goali.
As you know, I sometimes play a little game with the congregation on Friday evenings, Ask the Rabbi. It's risky, of course, because I never know what the questions will be, and they are usually quite far-ranging, which gives me a chance to think about the things that you are actually thinking about. Usually once a year, I reverse that procedure and ask you to tell me what subjects you'd like to hear addressed from the pulpit during the High Holy Days. I did that at the end of August this year and got some interesting suggestions. One topic did not even merit a mention this time around: the state of Israel. Perhaps because the state of Israel is so bewildering. After all, they are preparing for their 5th election in 4 years. The leader of the opposition is currently on trial on multiple charges of corruption and simultaneously is ahead in the polls. And the country has recently arrived at a working relationship with several Arab countries. Maybe we're all worn out by the complexity of Israel's existence. One question that did emerge from that Friday evening Q&A has had me thinking for weeks now. Someone asked, how can we live a more spiritual life? I wonder what was meant by spiritual life, and I also wonder what inspires the question. The question itself contains 2 unexplained presumptions. The first is that there is such a thing as a more spiritual life. The second presumption is that we are not living that life now. So let's begin with these questions. What do we mean when we speak of a spiritual life? I don't know what you might mean by that phrase, but I can tell you what it means generally and then particularly in Judaism. First, we need to examine the phrase itself. Is there such a thing as a spiritual life? If there is such a thing as a spiritual life, it seems to stand in contrast to something else. A physical life, a material life, an intellectual life. In some other religions, there is understood to be a disconnect between the physical and the spiritual. These seem to be 2 demanding realms, and a person has to choose which realm she occupies. The world we live in on a daily basis, hourly, is certainly very physical. The needs of the body must be met, as Maslow's hierarchy of human needs shows, before the person has the time, energy, or will to meet his spiritual needs. A starving person does not want to discuss the existence of evil in the world. She wants food and water. The assumption has been that primitive humans lived such a precarious existence just obtaining shelter, food, and water, that they had no time for spiritual matters. That, of course, is negated by several things. All over the world, there are places with arrangements of huge stones, clearly carved from quarries and transported by our ancient ancestors over some distance to be erected for a purpose we do not yet understand. But we know this: they provided no shelter from the environment, no protection against wild animals, and no food or water. Some speculate that they had very early religious importance and brought together people from significant distances. But why? We also have evidence from very ancient cave paintings of humans and animals being depicted as well, and sometimes as extremely large beings, human-like with animal features too, that sometimes appear fierce. We have archaeological evidence of human burials all over the world, many of which include what are called grave goods, food and drink, weapons, and what might be gifts or tribute items for the powers that preside on the other side of human life, the hereafter. So it seems that our ancestors did have some concepts that we might identify as spiritual, even though they do not correspond with our own. The Torah suggests this in the story of Cain and Abel, who, for reasons not given, bring offerings to Adonai. What was the impetus for such a gesture? We know that most, if not all, early civilizations had some sort of organized religion, which required its practitioners to bring gifts of food and drink to a sacred site where cult officials performed rituals to win the favor of the gods for the populace. So it would seem that Maslow's hierarchy does not help us to understand the role of spirituality in the lives of ancient humans. The archaeological evidence indicates that even before humans created cities and aqueducts, they felt a need to connect with something beyond themselves. So the question that was posed a few weeks ago about living a more spiritual life seems to have been with us for a very long time. The question implied that we mostly don't live much of a spiritual life. I take this to mean that we are so busy with material things, identifying what they are, why we need them, getting them, and then looking for other material things, that we overlook, ignore, resist, or reject the reality of the spiritual realm in our lives. Our ancestors lived with none of what are called modern conveniences, but they lived with a very real sense of a power beyond themselves. It's interesting to note that the Torah has no word for nature. Our ancestors understood what we now call nature as manifestations of either divine approval or disapproval. A hurricane, tornado, tsunami, volcano, thunder, lightning, clear skies, still waters, gentle rains, bountiful crops. It would not take a meteorologist to figure out what these things mean. What then does climate change tell us? But we live with such a cacophony of sounds, such a bombardment of sights, that we do not receive the messages of the spiritual realm around us. So I suggest that the first step in living a more spiritual life would be to reduce the sensory overload. Not all the time, not for long stretches. I suggest starting with 10 minutes every day. Either turn off or move away from your electronics and just sit still for 10 minutes.